Welcome to Make It To The Dogears. It's November 7th of 2021, and it's about 20 to the hour, 7 o'clock a.m. I'm watching Leaf by Leaf podcast. He has numerous books that I have never heard of, but I'm also really interested in the ones I'm reading. So let's start this one off with a philosophy text. Let's get into reading 25 minutes of random pages. Okay. This is on the account of the world's creation. The feast and those who provide gymnastic and scenic contests before they gather the spectators into the theater or the stadium have in readiness a number of combatants and performers to charm both eye and ear. Exactly in the same way the ruler of all things, like some provider of contests or of a banquet, when about to invite man to the enjoyment of a feast and a great spectacle, made ready beforehand the material for both. He desired to on coming to the world, man might at once find both a banquet and a most sacred display, the one full of all things of earth and rivers and sea and air, bring forth for use and for enjoyment, the other of all sorts of spectacles, most impressive in their substance, most impressive in their qualities, and circling with most wondrous movements, in an order fitly determined always in accordance with proportion of numbers and harmony of revolutions. In all these one might rightly say that there was the real music, the original and model of all other, from which the men of subsequent ages, when they had painted the images in their own souls, handed down an art most vital and beneficial to human life. Such is the first reason for which apparently man was created after all things. But we must mention a second that is not improbable. Directly he came into existence, man found there all provisions for life. This was for the instruction of future generations. Nature seemed almost to cry aloud in so many words that, like the first father of the race, they would spend the days without toil or trouble, surrounded by lavish abundance of all that they needed. And this will be so if irrational pleasures do not get control of the soul, making their assaults upon it through greediness and lust, nor the desires for glory or wealth or power arrogate to themselves the control of the life, nor sorrows lower and depress the mind, and to fear that evil counselor, do not dispel high impulses and noble deeds, nor folly and cowardice, and injustice and the countless host of other vices assail him. For in sooth, as things now are, when all these evils which have been recounted have won the day, and men have flung themselves unrestrainedly into the indulgence of their passions and left uncontrolled their guilty cravings, cravings which were sinful even to name, a fitting penalty is incurred, due punishment of impious courses. That penalty is difficulty in obtaining the necessaries of life. For men plow the prairies and irrigate it from spring and river, they sow and plant, and through the livelong year unwarily take up by day and night the ever-renewed toil of the tiller of the earth, and yet they are hard put to it to gather in their requisite supplies. These are times of poor quality and barely sufficient, having suffered injury from many causes. Either they were ravaged by recurring rainfalls, or being down in masses by the weight of hail that fell on them, or half frozen by snow, or torn up roots and all by violent winds. For water and air can, in many ways, change the fruitfulness of crops into barrenness. But if the unmeasured impulses of men's passions were calmed and allayed by self-mastery, and the earnestness and eager striving after the infliction of wrongs were checked by righteousness, if, in a word, the vices and the fruitless practices to which they prompt were to give place to the virtues and their corresponding activities, the warfare in the soul of all wars, veritably the most dire and most grievous, would have been abolished, and peace would prevail and would in quiet and gentle ways provide good order for the exercise of our faculties. It would be hoped that God, being a lover of virtue and a lover of what is good and beautiful, and also the lover of man, will provide for our race good things all coming forth spontaneously and all in readiness. For it is clear that it is easier without calling in the husbandman's art to supply in abundance the yield of the gross already existing than to bring into being things that were non-existent. Let what has been said suffice for an account of this second reason. A third is this: God being minded to unite in intimate and loving fellowship the beginning and end of created things, made heaven the beginning and man the end, the one the most perfect of imperishable objects of sense, the other the noblest of things earth-born and perishable, being in very truth a miniature heaven. He hears about within himself, he bears about within himself, like holy images, endowments of nature that correspond to the constellations. He has capacities for science and art, for knowledge, for the noble lore of the several virtues. For since the corruptible and the incorruptible are by nature contrary the one to the other, God assigned the fairest of each sort to the beginning and the end, heaven, as I have said, the beginning, and man to the end. Finally, this is suggested as a cogent reason. Man was bound to arise after all created things, in order that coming last and suddenly appearing to other animals, he might produce consternation in them. They were sure, as soon as they saw him, to be amazed and do homage to him, as to a born ruler or master, and so on. Beholding him, they were all tamed through all their kinds. Those who were most savage in their natures, at the first sight of him becoming at once most manageable, displaying their untamed pugnacity one against another, but to man and man alone showing gentleness and docility. That was from Philo Judaeus of Alexandria. That was really pretty, huh? That was really cool. Okay, this is Freud, psychoanalytic movement. Let's just read Freud. This is so people, I'm just saying my medication machine is gonna beep. Don't be alarmed. Okay, this is the final years. Final years looks like of Freud, and the back of it says the psychoanalytic movement. I'm inspired to read this. In 1938, Chancellor Schuschnigg was forced to resign under pressure from Hitler. The Nazi henchman Arthur Seyss-Inquart took over the government and invited the Germans into Austria. The Anschluss was accomplished. German troops poured over the border, and Nazism broke out in full force in Vienna, releasing Austria's own considerable anti-Semitism. Jewish apartment stores and synagogues were ransacked. Thugs roamed the neighborhoods searching for victims. Men and women were beaten and humiliated in the streets. Wilhelm Steckel fled Vienna on the day before the Nazi takeover, taking a train to Switzerland and leaving all his possessions behind. Eventually, he made his way to London. Another defector from the early days was heard from at this time, Carl Jung. I've heard a lot about him. After Hitler came to power in 1933, the International Psychotherapy Association and its journal were forced to adhere to the party line, purging psychoanalysts and Jews. Jung took over as president and editor of the journal, moving the base of the association to neutral Switzerland in order to protect Jewish members. In addition, he made some efforts to rescue Jewish psychotherapists from the Nazis. At the same time, he wrote articles extolling the superiority of the Aryan of the Jewish soul and proclaiming that Jews were not capable of understanding the Germanic people. His attempts to encompass political events in his theory of archetypes, he explained the rise of Hitler and the Nazis as the return of the Nordic god Wotan from the collective unconscious, were a muddle, and his politics, if it can be said to have any, leaned to the right. While he and his followers attempted to explain all that away after the war, while it was clear he was never a Nazi and pulled out of the association in 1940 when he was taken over by Hitler's men, this was not his finest hour. Jung's derogation of Jewish psychotherapy can best be understood if Freud is substituted for Jew and Freudian for Jewish. His anger at his former mentor and the committee remained alive, and led him to publish statements that, given the political context, could only be seen as sympathetic to the Nazis. Despite this anger, he sensed a danger to which Freud was personally exposed, and he and his colleague Franz Ricklin attempted to help. They sent the blonde and Aryan-looking Franz Ricklin Jr. to Vienna with $10,000 of their own money, with instructions that he give it to Freud and urge him to leave the city. Ricklin Jr. appeared at the door of Burgas 19 and was met by a suspicious Anna, who was hesitant to let him enter. Then Freud appeared, listened to the proposal, and turned down the money, saying, "I refuse to be beholden to my enemies." While the majority of Jews in Vienna were victimized by the Nazis after the Anschluss, the Freuds were spared for the most part, though a gang of stormtroopers did come to the apartment and confiscated $500. Now more than ever, friends and colleagues begged Freud to leave, yet he still could not make up his mind. Then the Nazis moved in on the psychoanalytic press and arrested Martin for a day. A week later, the Gestapo took Anna in for a day of questioning. Now Freud was convinced it was time to get out, but he had waited too long. Leaving would require papers and the payment of fees to the Nazi authorities, and this would be difficult. Fortunately, there were a number of friends who brought their influence to bear, including William Bullitt, the American ambassador in Paris, whose wife had been analyzed by Freud in 1930, and who had collaborated with Freud on a psychobiography of Woodrow Wilson. Bullitt used his position to get President Roosevelt and U.S. State Department to intercede with Germany on Freud's behalf. Princess Bonaparte used her money and position from Paris, and Ernest Jones his contacts and influence in London to secure entry visas to England. After some anxious weeks, the Freud party was permitted to leave Austria. Marcia, Minna, Matilda and her husband, and the lady Sophie's son Ernst all left for England. Martin and his son Anson Walter also left for London, while his wife Esty and their daughter Sophie went to Paris to stay with Esty's younger sister. Freud's younger brother Alexander, his wife, and his son Harry managed to get out to Switzerland, then to England, finally to Canada. In addition to these family members, the party included Freud's pet Chow, housekeeper Paula Fichtel, and Max Schur, his wife, and their two children. Freud's sisters Rosa, Mitzi, Pauline, and Dolphy, the oldest Anna, had been living in New York since the turn of the century. All in their 70s were left behind in Vienna. Jones then wrote that Freud and Alexander left them with a considerable sum of money, though this proved useless when the Nazis confiscated Jewish bank accounts. It is a widely circulated story that before finally allowing the party to leave, the German authorities made Freud sign a document stating that he had been treated with respect and consideration. It said that he asked if he could add something and wrote, "I can hardly recommend this Gestapo to anyone." It sounds like a fine bit of Freudian irony, though it would have been foolhardy to endanger so many lives on the very point of departure. The document has subsequently been found, and it contains no such comment. Perhaps it was what Freud imagined himself writing. Freud went by train to Paris, stayed overnight with Marie Bonaparte, and then took the night train to England the next day. On this final leg of the journey, he imagined himself William the Conqueror. I remember reading that Freud was really into those conqueror stories. Arriving in 1066, Jones was in London to welcome them. Freud's nephew Sam came down from Manchester for a visit, and others in England extended their hospitality and good wishes over the next weeks. He was even visited by 3 secretaries of the Royal Society, who asked that he had a signature to their official book, where it reposes along with those of Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and other illustrious scientists. Psychoanalytic movement. Okay, here's some more philosophy. I think this might be my last one. This video. We'll see. No, it's just I want to read this one. I need some time to think, I think. Yeah, right? This is Sextus Empiricus, Outlines of Pyrrhonism. And it says skepticism on the back. Let's read it. Also, we must give credence as being, relatively speaking, in a natural state. Sleeping and waking, too, give rise to different impressions, since we do not imagine when awake what we imagine asleep, or when asleep what we imagine when awake. So the existence or non-existence of our impressions is not absolute but relative, being in relation to our sleeping or waking condition. Probably then, in dreams we see things which to our waking state are unreal, although not wholly unreal, for they exist in our dreams, just as waking realities exist, although non-existent dreams. Age is another cause of difference, for the same air seems chilly to the old, but mild to those in their prime. The same color appears faint to older men, but vivid to those in their prime. And similarly, the same sound seems to the former faint, to the latter clearly audible. Moreover, those of different age are differently moved in respect of choice and avoidance. For whereas children, to take a case, are all eagerness for balls and hoops, men in their prime choose other things, and old men yet others. And from this we conclude that differences in age also cause different impressions to be produced by the same underlying objects. Another cause where the real objects appear different lies in motion and rest. For those objects which, when we are standing still, we see to be motionless, we imagine being in motion when we are sailing past them. Love and hatred are a cause, as when some have an extreme aversion to pork, while others greatly enjoy eating it. Hence, too, Menander said, "Mark now his visage, what a change is there! Since he has come to this, how bestial! 'Tis actions fair that make the fairest face." Many lovers, too, who have ugly mistresses think them most beautiful. Hunger and satiety are a cause, for the same food seems agreeable to the hungry, but disagreeable to the sated. Drunkenness and soberness are a cause, since actions which we think shameful when sober do not seem shameful to us when drunk. Predispositions are a cause, for the same wine which seems sour to those who have previously eaten dates or figs seems sweet to those who have just consumed nuts or chickpeas, and the vestibule of the bathhouse, which warms those entering from outside, chills those coming out of the bathroom if they stop long in it. Fear and boldness are a cause, as what seems to the coward fearful and formidable does not seem so in the least to the bold man. Grief and joy are a cause, since the same affairs are burdensome to those in grief, but delightful to those who rejoice. Seeing then that the dispositions also are the cause of so much disagreement, and the men are differently disposed at different times, although no doubt it is easy to say what nature each of the underlying objects appears to each man to possess, we cannot go on to say what its real nature is, since a disagreement admits in itself of no settlement. For the person who tries to settle it is either in one of the aforementioned dispositions, or no disposition whatsoever. But to declare that he is in no disposition at all, as for instance neither in health nor sickness, neither motion nor at rest, of no definite age, and devoid of all the other dispositions as well, is the height of absurdity. And if he is to judge the sense impressions, was he in one disposition, he will be a party to the disagreement. Moreover, he will not be an impartial judge of the external underlying objects, owing to his being confused by the dispositions in which he is placed. The waking person, for instance, cannot compare the impressions of sleepers with those of men awake, and a sound person knows the sick with those of sound, for we scent more readily things present, which affect us in the present than the things not present. Another way, too, the disagreement of such impressions is incapable of settlement, for he who prefers one impression to another, one circumstance to another, does so either uncritically and without proof, or critically and with proof, but can do this neither without these means, for then he would be discredited nor with them. For if he is to pass judgment on the impressions, he must certainly judge them by a criterion. This criterion, then, he will declare to be true or else false. But if false, he will be discredited. Whereas, if he shall declare it to be true, he will be stating that the criterion is true, either without proof or with proof. But if without proof, he will be discredited, and if with proof, it will certainly be necessary for the proof also to be true to avoid being discredited. Shall he then affirm the truth of the proof, adopt and establish a criterion after having judged it without judging it? If without judging, he will be discredited, but if after judging, Tony will say that he has judged it by a criterion. I like the philosophy, folks. I gotta just one sec.
And I think I've read the mail, it's the one about the post office. I read the post office, and that was my extent of those novels. And then I read through this last night of the Red Bonds. I do like where he often talks about going to the public library and reading through Western philosophers like Kant and Schopenhauer and so on. And he really did process them well. And some of these poems are impressive with their range of thought and depth of perception. But for some reason, I just haven't taken to Bukowski. And I had a friend that I used to talk to about this.
So the Stoics, pretty good stuff. Comprehending Dispositions, I guess, was that last one.
For some reason, he would always think on
Let's see.
not really liking costumes.
Yeah, that was skepticism.
Dickinson.
Um,
I love
let's see what this one is.
poetry. Of course, it's ultra compressed. I also saw
Book 2 of Ideas, and I think this is.
TV series on Apple TV
I'm not sure.
about Emily Dickinson. And
I'm taking a philosophy class, I
she
think.
really
So I want to be really good at this. I know I'm overstretching it.
I'm pretty sure that
No, let me just talk to the camera.
in school was the hard
I think I'm going to read this one too. I don't know if it's John Locke or Immanuel Kant, but
something like that.
it's really good philosophy.
That always
Anyway,
stuck with me. And then to ease
dreaming we take for true
beautiful
will be difficult to conclude from the nature of things, and that it never is so will bias to have clearer views of the nature of thinking substances.
Emerson.
Be best resolved in the goodness of God, for as far as the happiness or misery of any of his sensible creatures is concerned in it, not by a fatal error of theirs transfer from one to another, that consciousness which draws reward or punishment with it. How far this may be an argument against those who have placed thinking in a system of fleeting animal spirits, I leave to be considered. Yet to return to the question before us, it must be allowed that if the same consciousness, which has, as has been shown, is quite a different thing from the same numerical figure, motion, and body, can be transferred from one thinking substance to another, it will be possible that two thinking substances may make but one person. For the same consciousness being preserved, when the same or different substances, the personal identity is preserved. As to the second part of the question, with the same immaterial substance remaining, there may be two distinct persons. Which question seems to me to be built on this? With the same immaterial being conscious of the actions of its past duration, it be wholly stripped of all the consciousness of its past existence, and is it beyond the power of ever retrieving again, and so as it were beginning a new account from a new period, have a consciousness that cannot reach beyond this new state. All those who hold pre-existence are evidently of this mind, since they allow the soul to have no remaining consciousness of what it did in that pre-existent state, either wholly separate from body, or informing any of the body, and if they should not, 'tis plain, experience would be against them. So that personal identity reaching no further than consciousness reaches, a pre-existent spirit not having continued so many ages in a state of silence must needs make different persons. Suppose a Christian Platonist or Pythagorean should, upon God's having ended all his works of creation the seventh day, think a soul hath existed ever since, and should imagine it has revolved in several human bodies, as I once met with one, who was persuaded his had been the soul of Socrates, how reasonably I will not dispute. This I know, then the post he filled, which was no inconsiderable one, he passed for a very rational man, and the press has shown that he wanted not parts or learning. Would anyone say that he, being not conscious of any of Socrates' actions or thoughts, could be the same person with Socrates? Let anyone reflect upon himself and conclude that he has in himself an immaterial spirit, which is that which thinks in him, and the constant change of his body keeps him the same, and is that which he calls himself. Let him also suppose to be the same soul that was in Nestor or Thersites at the siege of Troy. For souls being, as far as we know anything of them in their nature, indifferent to any partial matter, the supposition has no apparent absurdity in it, which it may have been as well as is now the soul of any other man. But he, having no consciousness of any of the actions, either of Nestor or Thersites, does or can he conceive himself the same person with either of them? Can he be concerned in either of their actions, attribute them to himself, or think them his own more than the actions of any other man that ever existed? So that this consciousness not reaching to any of the actions of either of those men, he is no more oneself with either of them, than if the soul or immaterial spirit that now informs him, having created, began to exist, when it began to inform his present body, though it were never so true that the same spirit that informed Nestor's or Thersites' body were numerically the same that now informs his. This would no more making the same person with Nestor, that some of the particles of matter that were once a part of Nestor are now a part of this man, the same immaterial substance, without the same consciousness. And we're making the same person by being united to any body. And the same particle of matter, without consciousness united to anybody, makes the same person. I'm almost done, folks. Let him once find himself conscious of any of the actions of Nestor, and then finds himself the same person with Nestor. And that's when we may be able, without any difficulty, to conceive the same person through resurrection, though in a body not exactly in make or parts the same which we had here, the same consciousness going along with the soul that inhabits it. Yet the soul alone, in the change of bodies, which scarce to anyone, but whom makes the soul the man, be enough to make the same man. So the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, entering to form the body of a cobbler, as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees he would be the same person with the prince, accountable only for the prince's actions, who would say it was the same man. The body too goes to the making the man,